Welcome to Cryptid Monologues. Let's dive into a world where myths meet imagination. Here we unravel chilling tales of cryptids, Bigfoot, Wendigos, dogmen, skinwalkers, and more. These stories are crafted to ignite your imagination. These stories are purely fictitious, and names and/or events are purely coincidental. If you like these kind of stories, please give a like and subscribe. Click on the notification bell to stay up to date. Thanks for listening. Let's get into it. The Giant of Mount St Helens. Long before the eruption of Mount St Helens in 1980, the dense forests surrounding the volcano were steeped in mystery. The native Cowlitz and Klickitat tribes spoke of the Skookums, enormous hairy beings that lived in the shadow of the mountain. These creatures were said to be both guardians and hunters, their presence a warning to those who ventured too deep into their domain. In the 1920s, loggers near Ape Canyon reported terrifying encounters with massive, upright creatures that hurled rocks at their cabins at night. The area, named after these tales, became a hotspot for Bigfoot lore. As the decades passed, sightings persisted. Hunters spoke of guttural howls that echoed through the valleys, hikers found impossibly large footprints, and locals swore they saw shadowy figures slipping between the trees. For most, these stories were just that, tales to share around campfires. But for those who had encountered the creature, the legend was very real. Arrival in Cougar. Dr. Alina Morales knew of the Bigfoot stories before arriving in Cougar, Washington. As a geologist and volcanologist, her focus was on the earth beneath Mount St. Helens, not the myths that surrounded it. The volcano's explosive history fascinated her, and she was eager to study its post-eruption terrain. Staying in a small cabin just outside Cougar, Elena often visited the town's diner for breakfast. It was there that the stories began to seep into her routine. "You heading up the South Ridge today?" asked Tom, the diner's owner, one misty morning. "Yeah, I'm collecting rock samples," Elena replied, sipping her coffee. Tom leaned in. "You know, that's near Ape Canyon. Folks around here say it's one of the places they like to roam." "They?" "Bigfoot," Tom said with a grin. Elena laughed, but Tom's expression didn't waver. "I'm serious. A lot of folks seen things they can't explain up there. Just keep your eyes open, all right?" Elena nodded politely, but as she left the diner, she shook her head. Bigfoot wasn't part of her research. That afternoon, Elena hiked to a remote area south of Mount St. Helens, her GPS and rock hammer in hand. The forest was alive with birdsong, and the air was damp with the scent of fir trees and moss. She worked methodically, collecting samples and taking notes. But as the day wore on, she noticed strange details. Trees with their bark clawed off at impossible heights, enormous footprints in the soft soil, and a faint, musky odor that lingered in the air. At first, she dismissed these signs as the work of bears or weathered debris. But when she found a set of footprints leading toward a narrow gorge, her scientific curiosity got the better of her. The gorge was quiet, unnervingly so. Even the birds had fallen silent. As Elena followed the footprints, she felt the distinct sensation of being watched. Then she saw it. At the edge of the clearing, partially obscured by ferns and shadows, stood a massive figure. It was at least 8 feet tall, its body covered in dark, matted fur. Its face was a strange blend of human and ape, with deep-set eyes that gleamed with an unsettling intelligence. Elena froze, her breath caught in her throat. The creature watched her, its head tilting slightly as if assessing whether she was a threat. Instinctively, she reached for her camera, but the motion startled the creature. With a guttural grunt, it turned and disappeared into the trees, moving with a speed and grace that defied its size. Shaken but determined, Elena followed the trail. She found more signs of the creature: broken branches, flattened grass, and claw marks on trees. Finally, she stumbled upon a hidden shelter tucked beneath a rocky overhang. The makeshift structure was made of large branches, woven together with surprising precision. Inside were piles of leaves and moss, and scattered among them were animal bones and feathers. Elena's eyes widened as she spotted a thick strand of hair caught on one of the branches. She carefully collected it, placing it into a sample bag. The call for help. Shaken but exhilarated, Elena returned to her cabin as the sun dipped below the horizon. She couldn't stop replaying the encounter in her mind. The massive figure, the eerie intelligence in its eyes, and the strange, otherworldly presence it exuded. After carefully locking the door, she set the strand of hair on her makeshift workbench and stared at it under the dim cabin light. The coarse, dark fibers seemed almost alive with mystery. Her scientific instincts kicked in. She needed corroboration, analysis, and maybe, just maybe, a plan. Grabbing her satellite phone, Elena dialed the numbers of a few trusted colleagues. The first call was to Dr. Marcus Hayes, a primatologist and expert in North American wildlife. He was skeptical at first, but became intrigued when she described the footprints, the hair, and the creature's behavior. "You're sure this wasn't a bear or some kind of prank?" Marcus asked. "Marcus, I know what I saw," Elena said firmly. "This was no bear, and I've got physical evidence." After a long pause, Marcus replied, "I'm in. Where do we meet?" Next, she called Dr. Sarah Vick, an anthropologist with a keen interest in folklore and cryptozoology. Sarah was less skeptical. "You're telling me the legends might be true? Elena, you're sitting on one of the greatest discoveries of our time." Elena sighed. "Let's not jump to conclusions. I need you both here to help me figure this out." They agreed to meet her the next morning at the Cougar Diner. The following morning, the Cougar Diner was bustling with locals sipping coffee and swapping stories about logging and fishing. Elena sat at a corner booth, nervously stirring her tea. She had brought her field notes, photos of the footprints, and the sample of hair stored in a sealed vial. Marcus and Sarah arrived within minutes of each other, each carrying their own equipment. Marcus with a camera and tracking tools, Sarah with notebooks and an audio recorder. Tom, the diner owner, wandered over, his usual friendly grin plastered across his face. "Morning, Doc. More of your scientific crew?" Elena nodded. "Something like that." Tom chuckled. "Let me guess, you're all here for Bigfoot?" Marcus raised an eyebrow, glancing at Elena. She gave him a tight-lipped smile, and Tom wandered off, muttering something about city folks. Once they were alone, Elena recounted her encounter in detail. She described the footprints, the creature's appearance, and its warning gesture. She placed the hair sample on the table, and both Sarah and Marcus leaned in, examining it with a mix of awe and skepticism. "This is remarkable," Marcus said, running a magnifying glass over the vial. "If this is real, it could represent an unknown primate species, or something even more extraordinary." Sarah nodded. "The Cowlitz and Klickitat tribes have spoken of beings like this for centuries. If the legends are based on a real species, this changes everything." Elena leaned forward. "We need to approach this carefully. If we go blundering into the forest, we could scare it, or worse, drive it away from its habitat." "Or provoke it," Marcus added grimly. After some deliberation, the trio agreed on a cautious approach. They would return to the area Elena had described, but keep their team small and discreet. Marcus would bring tracking equipment and motion-activated cameras, while Sarah would document any evidence they found, from footprints to environmental disturbances. "Elena," Sarah said, "you'll lead us to the site, but after that, we follow your lead. This is your discovery." "It's not just my discovery. If this creature is real, it's part of something much bigger, our shared history, our world. We must protect it." Marcus nodded. "Agreed. Let's make sure we do this the right way." That afternoon, armed with their equipment and a shared sense of purpose, the three scientists ventured back into the wilderness. As they approached the gorge where Elena had first seen the creature, the forest seemed to grow quieter, as if holding its breath. The air was thick with tension, but also with the promise of something extraordinary waiting just beyond the trees. The forest felt different this time. The towering evergreens swayed gently in the breeze, but their movements cast shifting shadows that played tricks on the eye. The trio hiked in silence, their senses heightened with every crackling branch and rustling leaf. Elena led the way, retracing her steps toward the gorge. She kept glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see the creature watching them again. Marcus followed close behind, his eyes scanning the undergrowth for signs of movement. Sarah brought up the rear, her audio recorder running, hoping to capture any unexplainable sounds. "Hold up," Marcus whispered, raising a hand. They froze. The distant call of a bird had stopped abruptly, replaced by a deep stillness that settled over the forest like a heavy blanket. "Do you feel that?" Sarah whispered. Elena nodded. The air felt thick, charged with an energy she couldn't explain. Suddenly, Marcus crouched, motioning for them to come closer. He pointed to the ground, where a series of massive footprints pressed into the soft earth. They were fresh, so fresh that Elena could see the edges crumbling where soil had just been displaced. "It's close," Marcus whispered. As they followed the trail, the faint musky odor Elena had noticed before grew stronger. The footprints led them to a clearing where they found more evidence: large claw marks on a tree, broken branches, and tufts of coarse, dark hair tangled in the undergrowth. Sarah knelt beside one of the claw marks, running her fingers over the grooves. "These are too high for a bear," she said. "And the spacing, it matches a hand, not a paw." Marcus took out a motion-activated camera, securing it to a nearby tree. "If it's still around, we'll catch it," he said, though his tone betrayed a mix of excitement and apprehension. Elena felt a prickle at the back of her neck, as if they were being watched. She turned slowly, scanning the tree line. The shadows seemed to deepen, and for a moment she thought she saw movement, a flash of dark fur slipping between the trees. "Did you see that?" she whispered. Marcus and Sarah followed her gaze, but whatever it was had vanished. The gorge. They continued toward the gorge, the terrain growing steeper and more rugged. The air here felt colder, heavier, as if they were descending into a place untouched by time. When they reached the edge, Elena stopped abruptly. The gorge stretched out before them, its rocky walls shrouded in mist. The eerie silence was broken only by the faint trickle of a stream far below. "This is where I saw it," Elena said, her voice hushed. "And just beyond here." A low guttural growl echoed through the gorge, stopping her mid-sentence. Sarah gripped Elena's arm. "That wasn't a bear." "No," Marcus said, his face pale. "It wasn't." The sound came again, louder this time, reverberating off the canyon walls. It was deep and primal, carrying with it a sense of warning. "Whatever it is, it knows we're here," Elena said, her heart pounding. As they stood frozen at the gorge's edge, a shadow emerged from the mist below. The creature climbed with ease, its powerful limbs gripping the rocky walls. When it reached the top, it stood tall, its massive frame silhouetted against the fading light. Elena's breath caught in her throat. It was even larger than she remembered, its fur glistening with moisture, its amber eyes glowing with an unnatural intensity. The creature let out a sharp barking sound, then slammed its hand against a nearby tree with enough force to shake the ground beneath their feet. "It's telling us to leave," Sarah whispered. Marcus slowly raised his camera, but Elena grabbed his arm. "No," she said firmly. "Not yet." The creature stared at them, its expression unreadable but intense. It took a step closer, its massive footfalls reverberating through the ground. Then, with a guttural huff, it turned and disappeared into the forest, its movements swift and fluid, leaving the trio standing in stunned silence. "We should go," Marcus said, his voice tight. "Now." Elena hesitated, torn between her desire to learn more and the undeniable sense of danger. Finally, she nodded. "Let's get back to the cabin and regroup." As they retraced their steps, the forest seemed to close in around them, the shadows growing longer, the air colder. Every sound, a snapping twig, a distant rustle, set their nerves on edge. By the time they reached the trailhead, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and the first stars were beginning to appear. Back at the cabin, they reviewed their findings. Marcus had captured a faint growl on his audio recorder, and Sarah carefully cataloged the hair and claw mark samples they had collected. But it was the encounter at the gorge that weighed most heavily on their minds. "It wasn't just an animal," Elena said finally, breaking the silence. "It was communicating with us, warning us," Sarah nodded. "The question is, why? What is it protecting?" Marcus leaned back in his chair, his face thoughtful. Maybe it's not just protecting itself. Maybe it's protecting something or someone else. The three exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of the unknown settling over them like the dense forest canopy. And somewhere deep in the wilderness, the creature watched, its amber eyes glowing in the darkness, waiting to see if the humans would dare to return. The weight of evidence. The cabin was dimly lit, a single lantern casting flickering shadows across the walls. The air inside was thick with tension as Elena, Marcus, and Sarah pored over their findings. The hair samples were carefully stored, the photos of the massive footprints laid out on the table, and the audio recording of the growl played on repeat. Sarah jotted down notes, her handwriting hurried but precise. "The growl is too low frequency for any known predator in this region. It's not a bear, not a cougar. It's something else." Marcus nodded, leaning over the microscope to examine the hair sample again. "It's coarse, like primate hair, but not identical to anything I've seen. It's denser, almost like it's adapted for extreme environments." Elena sat silently, her arms crossed, staring at the photos. "It's not just an animal," she said, her voice low. "The way it moved, the way it looked at us, it's intelligent. It knew we were intruding." Sarah set her pen down. "That raises a bigger question. Why would something like this stay hidden for so long? We're not talking about a single creature here. If it's a species, there must be a population, even if it's small." "That gorge," Marcus said, pointing to the map spread across the table. "It's remote, rugged, perfect for something that doesn't want to be found." "But why show itself at all? Why not just stay hidden?" "It wanted us to leave," Elena replied. That much was clear. As the night deepened, they speculated about what the creature could be. "It could be a relic species," Marcus suggested, "an offshoot of Gigantopithecus that somehow survived in isolation." Sarah shook her head. "If it were purely animalistic, it wouldn't act the way this one did. The legends describe them as more than animals, guardians, protectors." "Protectors of what?" Elena asked. "The land, maybe," Sarah said, "or something we haven't even discovered yet." Elena sighed, running a hand through her hair. "If we publish this, if we tell anyone, it'll bring people, hunters, poachers, curiosity seekers. We'd be exposing it to danger." Marcus leaned back, rubbing his temples. "But if we don't share this, it's just another story, another myth. What's the point of science if we don't seek the truth?" The room fell silent, each of them grappling with the ethical dilemma. A visit from Tom, the knock at the cabin door, startled them all. Marcus nearly spilled his coffee, and Sarah froze mid-sentence. Elena approached the door cautiously. "Who is it?" "It's Tom," came the familiar voice of the diner owner. She opened the door, and Tom stepped inside, his weathered face creased with concern. He glanced at the evidence on the table and sighed. "I figured you'd find something out there." "What do you mean?" Elena asked. Tom took a seat, removing his hat. "You're not the first to see it, you know. Folks around here have stories going back generations, but most people don't believe them, and those who do, well, they don't usually stick around long." "You've seen it?" Sarah asked. Tom nodded slowly. "Years ago, when I was hunting elk near Ape Canyon. I didn't see it up close, but I felt it, that weight in the air, like the forest itself was alive and watching. And I heard it, the same sound you've got on that recorder. Why didn't you tell anyone? Marcus asked. Tom shrugged. What good would it do? The people who believe don't need convincing, and the ones who don't, they'd just bring trouble. Elena exchanged a glance with her colleagues. So what do we do? Tom stood, placing his hat back on. If you're smart, you'll leave it be. There are some things out here that don't belong to us, and whatever it is, it's been here a hell of a lot longer than we have. After Tom left, the three scientists sat in silence, the weight of his words sinking in. We're not hunters, Sarah said finally. We're here to study, to understand, but he's right. If we expose this, we could destroy it. Elena nodded. We document what we can, but we don't publish. Not yet. We need more evidence, and we need a plan to protect the creature if we do decide to go public. Marcus hesitated. This goes against everything I've been taught. Science is about discovery, about sharing knowledge. Science is also about responsibility, Elena countered. And we have a responsibility to this creature, to its habitat. Marcus sighed. Fine. For now, we keep this between us. But if we find definitive proof, we're going to have a much harder choice to make. That night, as the others slept, Elena stepped outside, the cool air biting at her skin. She looked toward the dark outline of Mount St Helens, the stars scattered like dust above its peak. Somewhere out there, the creature was watching, waiting. She could feel it, a presence as ancient and unyielding as the mountain itself. For now, the forest was quiet, but she knew this was only the beginning. The creature was a mystery she couldn't ignore, a question that demanded answers. And in the depths of the wilderness, the forest held its secrets, biding its time. The balancing act. Despite the weight of her discovery, Elena couldn't forget the reason she had come to Cougar in the first place. Her research on Mount St Helens post-eruption geology remained unfinished, a looming task she could no longer put off. The region's volcanic activity and the shifting landscape presented a fascinating opportunity to study the forces of nature at work, but the recent events had taken a toll on her focus. The thought of returning to the south side of the mountain gnawed at her. The area was known for its unstable terrain, but the data was essential for understanding the long-term recovery of the ecosystem after the eruption. She had already missed several days of research, and her team back at the university was expecting updates. Marcus and Sarah had both urged her to be cautious, to take time and regroup after their encounter. But Elena knew she couldn't ignore her responsibilities, both scientific and personal. The creature, the mystery of its existence, would have to wait. The next morning, after a restless night of debate, Elena packed her equipment for the south side of Mount St Helens. The air outside was cold, the mist from the mountain swirling like an ethereal veil. The road was quiet as she drove toward the trailhead, passing through the small town of Cougar, where the morning fog clung to the trees, creating an eerie atmosphere. As she neared the forest entrance, the creature consumed her thoughts. She hadn't shared everything with Marcus and Sarah. There was more she hadn't told them about her encounter. The creature's eyes, the way it seemed to understand her, the warning it had issued. It felt wrong to leave the mystery unresolved, but the work awaited her, and so she pushed the unsettling thoughts aside, focusing instead on the landscape ahead. The road narrowed as she turned off onto the winding trail that led into the heart of the mountain. The dense trees on either side created a canopy so thick that little light penetrated through. Elena gripped the steering wheel, her eyes scanning the woods. The stillness of the forest felt oppressive, as though it were holding its breath. By the time Elena reached the trailhead on the south side of the mountain, the sun had fully risen, casting a pale light over the jagged volcanic landscape. She pulled her car into a small parking area, unloaded her gear, and started her trek into the woods. The air was cool, and the ground was uneven, the volcanic soil still recovering from the eruption. As she made her way deeper into the forest, Elena's scientific mind shifted back into gear. She needed to collect soil samples, measure gas emissions from fumaroles, and document the regrowth of the flora. These were all essential pieces of the puzzle that would help her understand how this ecosystem had begun to recover after the eruption. But even as she focused on her work, the memory of the creature lingered, like an unwelcome shadow. Each time the wind stirred the trees, Elena found herself flinching, half expecting to hear the deep, rumbling growl from the gorge. By mid-afternoon, Elena had reached a plateau that offered a clear view of the southern slopes of Mount St Helens. She set up her equipment, taking soil samples and documenting the volcanic rock formations. However, as she worked, she noticed small, peculiar signs scattered around her research site. Footprints in the soft mud. The prints were large, much larger than any bear's. The shape was odd, too. Elongated toes, a depth that suggested considerable weight, and a stride that was distinctly human in appearance. She frowned and knelt to examine the prints more closely. She couldn't help but wonder if this was another sign of the creature. But there was something else about these prints that unsettled her. They were fresh. She stood up and looked around. The forest felt unnervingly quiet, almost too quiet. The only sound was the rustle of the wind through the trees. Could it have followed her? As the thought crossed her mind, the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. She scanned the surrounding forest, her heart pounding. The feeling of being watched washed over her again. Just as Elena began to gather her things, preparing to leave the area, she heard something. A low, sharp sound, not unlike the rustling of a large animal moving through the underbrush. The sound came from the direction of the ridge above her, and it was unmistakably purposeful. Without thinking, Elena took a step back, her pulse quickening. She told herself it was just an animal, perhaps a deer or a bear, but the chill that ran down her spine told her otherwise. Her instincts screamed at her to leave, to retreat to the safety of her car and head back to the cabin. But the scientist in her couldn't ignore the pull of the unknown. She had come this far, and she wasn't about to turn back now, especially after everything she had seen and felt. Taking a deep breath, Elena slowly crouched down and began to pack up her equipment with deliberate care. The sound from the ridge came again, closer this time. She froze. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything she'd ever heard before. A sudden crashing noise, followed by a heavy thud, made her heart leap into her throat. She shot a glance over her shoulder. Something or someone was moving swiftly through the trees. But this time, it didn't feel like a warning. It felt like a challenge. For the next several minutes, Elena remained as still as possible, holding her breath. Her heart pounded in her chest, and every instinct screamed at her to run. She couldn't shake the feeling that the creature was near, that it was watching her again from the shadows. She felt the ground beneath her shift slightly, as though something massive was moving just out of sight. Then, as suddenly as it had come, the presence vanished. The forest returned to its unnatural quiet. With shaky hands, Elena packed the last of her things and quickly made her way back to the trail. Her mind raced with conflicting thoughts. Her scientific curiosity, her growing fear, the gnawing sense that something far more profound than she could comprehend was unfolding just beneath the surface. By the time she reached her car and drove back to the cabin, the feeling of being watched lingered, clinging to her like a second skin. The mystery wasn't over. A return to the cabin. By the time Elena arrived back at the cabin, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the landscape. The familiar, comforting sight of the rustic wooden structure did little to calm her nerves. Her pulse was still racing, the unsettling presence she'd felt on the mountain clinging to her like a second skin. As she pulled up to the cabin, she saw Marcus and Sarah sitting on the porch, their faces lit by the soft glow of a lantern. They were waiting for her, though neither seemed particularly surprised to see her return so soon. Elena shut off the car engine and stepped out, taking a deep breath as she walked up to the porch. Her legs felt heavy, and every step seemed to take more effort than the last. "You're back early," Marcus said, raising an eyebrow as she approached. Elena nodded, but her mind was elsewhere, still replaying the eerie sounds from the ridge. I found more signs. There are footprints, larger than a bear's, fresh." Sarah's expression shifted from casual to serious. "Fresh?" she asked, leaning forward. "What do you mean?" "I mean, they were recent," Elena said, her voice tight. "I don't know how to explain it, but they were almost human in shape, and there was something else, something I can't quite put my finger on." Marcus and Sarah exchanged a glance, both clearly on edge. "Did you see anything?" Marcus asked, his voice low. Elena hesitated, her thoughts spinning. She wanted to say no, to dismiss the feeling as just nerves or imagination, but she couldn't. "No, but I felt it, like I was being watched." Sarah stood up, her face pale. "We need to go back tomorrow. Get more evidence. If it's not a bear, it's something else, and we need to know what we're dealing with." Elena shook her head, her eyes locked on the ground. "I don't think we should. I don't think it's safe. Something's out there, something aware of us." The three of them fell into silence, the weight of Elena's words hanging in the air. The cabin was filled with the soft hum of the portable gas analyzer as Elena spread out her collected data across the wooden table. Soil samples in labeled containers, a notebook filled with detailed sketches of the terrain, and the digital recorder sat among the maps and geological readings. The others, Marcus and Sarah, huddled close, eager to hear more about what she had found on the south side of Mount St Helens. Elena leaned forward, her fingers tracing the contour lines on the map as she began to recount her experience. "When I got to the ridge, everything felt wrong. The air was heavy, like the forest itself was warning me to leave. Then I found these tracks." She held up a photograph of the enormous, human-like footprints pressed into the volcanic soil. Sarah examined the photo, her brow furrowing. "These are massive, and they look deliberate, like something walking upright, not an animal." "That's not all," Elena continued. She pulled out her notebook and flipped to a page filled with hastily scrawled notes. "The seismic readings in the area showed some unusual activity. Small tremors concentrated near a fumarole I was studying. At first I thought it was just routine geothermal movement, but," she hesitated, glancing at the portable analyzer on the table. "But what?" Marcus pressed, his tone a mix of curiosity and concern. Elena gestured to the device. "The gas levels are dangerous. Carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, higher than they should be for this side of the mountain. I ran the numbers twice to be sure. If the concentrations keep rising, it could indicate increased volcanic activity." Sarah's eyes widened. "You're saying the mountain might be waking up again?" "Not necessarily," Elena replied, "but something's shifting beneath the surface. The geothermal system isn't stable, and if there's a buildup of pressure—" "An eruption?" Marcus asked, his voice low. Elena nodded grimly. "It's a possibility. Maybe not soon, but the signs are there, and if it happens, it could destabilize the entire region." Marcus leaned back in his chair, his mind visibly churning. "So let's say the mountain is gearing up for something. What does that have to do with the creature? Why would it show itself to you now?" Elena shook her head. "I don't know. But think about it. If it's tied to the land somehow, it might sense the danger. Maybe it's protecting something, or maybe it's just reacting to the changes." Sarah looked thoughtful, her fingers tapping against the edge of the table. "The legends say Bigfoot is a guardian of the forest, right? If the mountain's in trouble, it makes sense that it would be more active, more visible." Elena exhaled deeply, rubbing her temples. "That's the part I can't get out of my head. It felt like it was warning me, not just to leave, but about something bigger, like it knew what's coming." The room fell silent as the weight of her words sank in. Determined to make sense of her findings, Elena turned her attention back to the data. She pulled up the seismic readings on her laptop, overlaying them with the map of the region. The tremors she had recorded were clustered near the fumarole, but also extended into the area where she had seen the tracks. "This doesn't add up," she muttered, mostly to herself. "The movement isn't just random, it's concentrated, almost like there's a fracture zone forming." Marcus leaned over her shoulder, studying the screen. "Could it be a magma intrusion?" "Maybe," Elena said. "Or it could be a shift in the hydrothermal system. Either way, it's not normal." Sarah's eyes flicked between the map and the footprints in the photo. What if the creature isn't just reacting to the changes? What if it's moving because of them? If the mountain is becoming unstable, it might be displacing them, or whatever's out there. Elena paused, considering the possibility. If it's been living in this region for centuries, any major geological shift could force it out of its habitat. "And force it closer to us," Marcus added. As the night wore on, Elena began cross-referencing her data with historical records of Mount St Helens activity. What she discovered made her blood run cold. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a series of old reports on her laptop. "The fumarole area I studied today was near a fault line that became active just before the 1980 eruption. Increased gas emissions, small tremors, these were all precursors to the big event." Marcus and Sarah leaned in closer, their faces reflecting the same unease Elena felt. "But the activity didn't start until recently," Sarah said, frowning. "What triggered it?" "I don't know," Elena admitted. "But if the gas levels keep rising and the tremors intensify, we could be looking at another eruption, or at least significant geothermal activity." "And the creature?" Marcus asked. Elena looked at him, her expression grim. "If it's connected to the land, it might already know what's coming. And if we don't figure this out, we could all be in danger." The cabin grew quiet again, except for the faint rustle of the wind outside. The lantern on the table flickered, casting shifting shadows across the walls. "Tomorrow," Elena said finally, her voice steady, "we go back to the south side. We need more data on the gas levels, the tremors, and the creature's movements. If this is as big as I think it is, we don't have much time to prepare." Sarah and Marcus exchanged glances, then nodded. But as they prepared for bed, the feeling of unease lingered. The mountain was stirring, and the forest seemed alive with secrets. Somewhere in the darkness, the creature watched and waited, its presence a silent reminder that they were not alone, and that the danger beneath the surface was far greater than any of them had imagined. Into the heart of the mountain. The next morning, Elena, Marcus, and Sarah prepared for their expedition with a quiet sense of urgency. The forest around the cabin was still shrouded in mist as they loaded their equipment into Marcus's truck: seismic sensors, gas analyzers, GPS devices, and survival gear. "This isn't just about the creature anymore," Elena said, her voice steady but tinged with tension. "If the mountain is becoming unstable, we need to figure out how bad it is, and fast." Marcus nodded. "Agreed, but we're not going in blind. We stick together, no wandering off. If we see anything unusual, creature or otherwise, we pull back immediately." Sarah checked the batteries on the handheld radio and gave a firm nod. "Got it. Let's move." The drive to the south side of Mount St Helens was tense but uneventful. The forest seemed quieter than usual, the stillness almost oppressive. Elena couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, but she didn't mention it. The others likely felt it too. When they reached the trailhead, they parked the truck and began their hike toward the fumarole. The path was rugged and overgrown in places, the terrain marked by jagged volcanic rock and patches of new vegetation. As they approached the fumarole, the air grew noticeably warmer, carrying the faint smell of sulfur. Elena paused to take readings with her portable gas analyzer. CO2 levels are elevated, she said, frowning at the screen. And SO2 is higher than yesterday. This isn't normal. Marcus glanced at the analyzer. Could be a magma intrusion. If the gas is rising, it means pressure is building underground. Sarah crouched near a patch of ground where steam was escaping through a narrow crack. Look at this. She gestured to the surrounding soil, which was cracked and discolored. This wasn't here last month. The ground's heating up. Elena knelt beside her, placing a temperature probe into the soil. The reading confirmed Sarah's observation. Temperatures were abnormally high for the area. This area wasn't on any active watch lists, Elena murmured, her brow furrowed. If this activity is new, it could mean the hydrothermal system is destabilizing. Marcus scanned the surrounding area with binoculars. We're close to the ridge, aren't we? The place where you saw the tracks, Elena nodded, just beyond those trees. The three of them exchanged a glance, and then continued their trek, moving cautiously toward the ridge. When they reached the ridge, Elena immediately recognized the spot where she had found the footprints. The prints themselves were gone, likely obscured by the recent rain, but the area still felt different. The air was heavier, and the ground beneath their feet seemed softer, almost spongy in places. She pulled out her notebook and began comparing her notes from the previous day. This doesn't make sense. The tremors should have been more spread out, but they're concentrated right here. It's like the fault line is shifting directly under this area. Marcus set up a portable seismic sensor, and within minutes it began picking up faint vibrations. Tremor activity is low but consistent, he said, studying the readout. It's like a heartbeat. Something's moving below us. Sarah had wandered a few feet away and was examining the edge of the ridge. Elena, Marcus, come look at this. They joined her and saw what she had found, a series of deep fissures running along the ridge, some wide enough to peer into. Steam wafted from the cracks, and the faint sound of bubbling water echoed from below. This is bad, Elena said, her voice tight. If these fissures are connected to the hydrothermal system, it means the pressure is escaping, but not evenly. That could lead to a sudden release. Marcus looked concerned. A phreatic eruption? Possibly, Elena said. And if the magma is rising too? She didn't finish the thought, but they all understood the implication. As they worked, documenting the fissures and collecting more samples, the forest seemed to close in around them. The stillness was unnerving, and every sound, every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves set them on edge. At one point, Sarah froze mid-step and held up a hand. Did you hear that? They stopped and listened. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the wind. Then faintly, the low guttural growl Elena had heard the day before. Marcus looked at Elena and Sarah and said, "We're not alone." Elena felt her pulse quicken. "Keep working. We need this data. If it's out there, we're not provoking it. Just stay calm." The growl didn't come again, but the feeling of being watched persisted. As the day wore on, the data they gathered painted a grim picture. Gas levels were continuing to rise, and the seismic activity was increasing in both frequency and intensity. The fissures near the ridge suggested that pressure was building rapidly underground, creating a volatile situation. By late afternoon, Elena had enough information to confirm her fears. If this continues, we're looking at a potential eruption. It might not be catastrophic, but it could still cause massive damage, and it's unpredictable. We need to report this to the Geological Survey as soon as we get back. Marcus and Sarah nodded, but neither looked relieved. The weight of the discovery and the presence in the forest hung over them like a storm cloud. As they packed up their gear and began the hike back to the truck, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that they were leaving something undone. The creature, the mountain, the signs, it all felt connected, part of a larger story she didn't yet understand. But for now, the immediate danger was clear. The mountain was stirring, and time was running out. Notification to the U.S. Geological Survey. The group returned to the cabin as dusk began to settle over the forest. Shadows stretched long and dark, the towering trees seeming to close in around them. Despite their exhaustion from the day's expedition, no one said much during the drive back. Each of them was lost in thought, grappling with the implications of their findings. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was tense. Elena spread their gathered data across the table once again, pulling up seismic readouts and gas measurements on her laptop. Marcus brewed a pot of coffee while Sarah double-checked their notes, adding annotations to the photographs they'd taken of the fissures. "This isn't something we can sit on," Elena said, breaking the silence. Her voice was firm, but her eyes betrayed a hint of worry. "If the hydrothermal system is destabilizing, and there's even a chance of magma intrusion, we need to report it now." Marcus nodded, his usual skepticism nowhere to be found. "Agreed. The Geological Survey needs to know. This isn't just a local problem, it could affect the whole region." Sarah placed the annotated photos on the table. "And the creature? Are we mentioning that?" Elena hesitated. "Not directly, at least not yet. We don't have concrete evidence, and I don't want to risk our credibility. Let's stick to the geological threat for now." With that, Elena picked up the satellite phone, dialing the direct line to the regional office of the U.S. Geological Survey. The phone rang twice before a voice answered. "USGS Cascades Volcano Observatory. This is Dr. Anders." "Dr. Anders, this is Elena Morales," she began, her tone measured but urgent. "I'm conducting a study near Mount St Helens, and we've identified some concerning activity on the south side of the mountain." "What kind of activity?" Anders asked, his voice sharpening with interest. Elena quickly summarized their findings. "Elevated CO2 and SO2 emissions, abnormal ground temperatures, and a series of fissures near a fumarole on the south ridge. We've also recorded consistent low-frequency tremors in the same area." There was a pause on the other end. "You're certain about these readings?" "Absolutely," Elena replied. "We double-checked everything in the field and corroborated it with historical data from the 1980 eruption. The patterns are eerily similar." Anders let out a low breath. "This could be significant. Are you detecting any deformation? Changes in the surface elevation?" Marcus, overhearing the question, motioned for the laptop. He quickly pulled up a topographic comparison of the area and pointed to a slight bulge in the recent data. Elena relayed the information. "There's minor deformation," she confirmed. "It's subtle but present." Anders didn't hesitate. "This warrants immediate investigation. I'll assemble a team to assess the site, but it might take a day or two for us to get there. In the meantime, I need you to evacuate the area. If the pressure beneath the surface releases suddenly, it could trigger a phreatic eruption without warning." Elena exchanged a glance with Marcus and Sarah. "Understood. We'll leave first thing tomorrow." "And Morales," Anders added, his tone serious. "Good work. But don't take any risks. Whatever's happening up there, it's volatile." After the call ended, the cabin was quiet again, save for the faint crackle of the wood stove. "So that's it?" Marcus asked, leaning back in his chair. "We just pack up and wait for the professionals to swoop in?" Elena shook her head. "We've done our part. Reporting it was the right thing to do. But Anders is right. This situation is dangerous. Staying any longer would be reckless." Sarah, however, looked conflicted. "What about the creature? If the mountain is destabilizing, it might be forced out of its habitat, or worse, caught in the eruption. Shouldn't we try to find out more before we leave?" Elena sighed. "I know how you feel, but the data takes priority. If the Geological Survey confirms our findings, they'll close the area and monitor it closely. The creature, it's not something we can control." Marcus folded his arms. "So we pack up, leave, and hope the creature doesn't end up in the middle of a disaster?" Elena hesitated. "If it's as tied to the land as the legends suggest, it might already know how to protect itself. but we can't risk our lives chasing shadows." As they prepared to leave, the tension in the cabin didn't ease. Each of them felt the weight of what they were leaving behind, both the geological threat and the unanswered questions about the creature. That night, as the wind howled through the trees, none of them could sleep. Elena sat by the window, staring out into the darkness, her mind racing. The mountain seemed alive, pulsing with an energy she couldn't quite explain. Somewhere out there, the creature was watching, waiting, and deep beneath the surface, the earth was stirring. The call had been made, the warning delivered. But for Alina, Marcus, and Sarah, the feeling of unfinished business was impossible to shake. Tomorrow, they would leave. But the story of Mount St. Helens and the secrets it held was far from over. The USGS response. The morning after Elena's call, the U.S. Geological Survey mobilized a team to assess the reported activity. Dr. Anders led the group, a seasoned volcanologist with decades of experience monitoring the volatile peaks of the Cascades. Alongside him were geochemists, geophysicists, and technicians equipped with advanced monitoring tools, drones for aerial surveys, portable spectrometers for gas analysis, and ground-penetrating radar to map subsurface changes. When they arrived at the south side of Mount St. Helens, the team quickly established a base camp near the fumarole. The gas concentrations Elena had reported were confirmed almost immediately. Elevated levels of carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide streamed from the fissures, and ground temperatures were alarmingly high. "We're looking at a classic precursor scenario," Anders said, examining the data on his tablet. Gas buildup, seismic tremors, surface deformation, it's all there. The question is how far along the system is. Meanwhile, Elena, Marcus, and Sarah had retreated to a ranger station near Cougar, as directed by Dr. Anders. While Marcus and Elena were focused on organizing their findings and preparing to brief the incoming USGS team further, Sarah seemed distracted. She lingered near the window, her gaze fixed on the distant silhouette of the mountain. Her fingers tapped absently on the table, and a faint tension lined her face. "Sarah?" Elena asked, noticing her unease. "You've been quiet all morning. What's on your mind?" Sarah hesitated, then turned to face her. "I've been thinking about the creature. If the USGS team is investigating, they need to know about it." Marcus frowned. "You're not seriously suggesting we tell them, are you? We don't have solid proof. They'll think we're crazy." "But what if it's relevant?" Sarah pressed. "If the creature's movements are tied to the mountain's activity, it could be another indicator of what's happening underground." Elena sighed. "Sarah, I get it. I do. But without evidence, tracks, a clear photo, something, they won't take it seriously." Sarah crossed her arms, her expression firm. "Then I'll tell them what I saw. They deserve to know." Later that day, when the USGS team returned to Cougar for a preliminary briefing, Sarah took her opportunity. The team had gathered in a conference room at the ranger station, where Elena presented their data and findings. "This is invaluable work," Anders said, nodding in approval. "Your observations have given us a critical head start. We're monitoring the situation closely now." As the meeting began to wrap up, Sarah stood. "Dr. Anders, there's something else you need to know." Anders raised an eyebrow, and the room fell silent. "Go on." Sarah took a steadying breath. "While we were on the mountain, we encountered something unusual. Large tracks in the volcanic soil, far too big to be human. And at night, we heard sounds, growls, deep and guttural. Whatever it was, it's not a known animal." Anders exchanged a skeptical glance with one of his colleagues. "Are you suggesting a connection to the mountain's activity?" "Yes," Sarah said, her voice unwavering. "The local legends speak of a guardian tied to Mount St. Helens, the creature people call Bigfoot. I know how it sounds, but I believe it's reacting to geological changes. If we ignore it, we could miss an important piece of the puzzle." The room was silent for a moment, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Anders finally spoke, his tone measured. "We deal in science, not folklore. But if there's a pattern in this region's history that aligns with seismic or volcanic events, we should at least consider it as part of the broader context. Do you have physical evidence of these tracks or sounds? Sarah hesitated, then shook her head. No, just our observations. Anders nodded. I'll note your account, but without evidence it remains anecdotal. If you encounter anything else, anything concrete, document it. In the meantime, we need to focus on the immediate geological threat. After the meeting, Sarah felt a mix of relief and frustration. She had spoken the truth, but whether it would have influence was unclear. Elena approached her, placing a hand on her shoulder. You did the right thing. Even if they don't fully believe you, at least the idea is out there. Maybe, Sarah said, staring out the window at the mountain. But I can't shake the feeling that the creature knows something we don't, and if we don't pay attention, we're going to miss it. Back on the mountain, Anders and his team made a startling discovery. While analyzing the fissures, they found strange markings along the edges, scratches too deep and deliberate to be caused by natural erosion. What the hell made these? One of the technicians murmured, running a hand along the jagged grooves. Anders frowned, his mind racing. He didn't want to admit it, but Sarah's account lingered in the back of his mind. Something about this mountain felt different, as if it were alive in ways they hadn't yet understood. Document everything, he ordered, his voice clipped. We need every detail. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the mountain's secrets remained shrouded in darkness. But for Sarah, Elena, and the USGS team, one thing was clear. Mount St. Helens was far from dormant, and its mysteries were just beginning to surface. Back at the ranger station, Sarah couldn't shake the frustration of being dismissed by the USGS. While Anders and his team focused on the volcanic threat, she was convinced that understanding the creature could provide crucial insights. We're not done here, Sarah said, her voice steady as she paced the cabin that evening. The creature is tied to the mountain somehow. We've seen the signs, its tracks, the growls, even the markings Anders' team found. If we leave now, we might miss our chance to figure out what it knows. Marcus looked skeptical but intrigued. And how do you propose we investigate? Without ending up on the evening news as those conspiracy theorists who chased Bigfoot? Elena, seated at the table and poring over her notes, sighed. I hate to admit it, but Sarah has a point. There's something unusual about this whole situation. If the creature really is reacting to the geological changes, it could give us more context, or at least some warning signs. Sarah leaned forward, determination shining in her eyes. Then we go back. Not to the fumaroles, but deeper into the forest. Follow the path where I found those tracks. If the creature's habitat overlaps with the fault line, we'll learn something about both. Marcus groaned but grabbed his field pack. Fine, but if we find nothing, I'm reserving the right to say, I told you so, for the next decade. Early the next morning, the trio set out. Armed with trail cams, thermal imaging equipment, and a drone, they aimed to gather evidence of either the creature or the geological shifts. The forest was eerily quiet as they trekked deeper into the wilderness, far beyond the established trails. The dense canopy above filtered the sunlight into faint, dappled patches on the ground. This area is completely off the grid, Sarah said, consulting her GPS. No hiking trails, no campsites. If the creature's real, this is where it would stay. They moved cautiously, scanning the ground for tracks or other signs of movement. About an hour into their hike, Marcus paused, kneeling near a patch of disturbed soil. Hey, look at this, he said, motioning for the others. In the dirt were massive impressions, unmistakably footprints. The prints were nearly twice the size of a human's, with deep defined grooves where toes might have been. Those are fresh, Sarah whispered, her voice tinged with excitement. Elena crouched beside the prints, using a ruler to measure their size. This matches the tracks we saw near the fumaroles. Whatever made these is heavy, Look at the depth of the impressions. It's not a hoax. Marcus set up a trail cam aimed at the path the tracks seemed to follow. If it comes back this way, we'll catch it on video. As they continued, they found more evidence. Broken branches at unusual heights, patches of moss scraped clean from boulders, and strange markings etched into tree trunks. These scratches looked deliberate, Elena noted, examining a tree. Too high for a bear, and the patterns too regular. Marcus snapped photos while Sarah scanned the area with the thermal imaging device. "I've got a heat signature," she said suddenly, her voice low. Elena and Marcus turned to look at her screen. A faint, humanoid shape appeared in the distance, just at the edge of the thermal camera's range. "It's watching us," Sarah murmured. "Or stalking us," Marcus muttered, his hand instinctively reaching for the bear spray clipped to his belt. Elena waved for them to stay still. "Let's not provoke it. Keep your distance and document everything." The figure lingered for a moment, then vanished into the forest. They followed the tracks to a clearing surrounded by towering basalt formations. In the center of the clearing was something none of them expected, a circle of stones, carefully arranged, with strange symbols carved into their surfaces. "What is this?" Marcus asked, his voice tinged with awe. Elena crouched to examine the carvings. "These aren't natural, they're too precise, but they don't match any known cultural markings from this area." Sarah knelt beside her, running her fingers over the stones. "What if this is the creature's doing? It could be a territorial marker, or something more." Elena looked thoughtful. "Or it could be tied to the mountain. If this creature has lived here for centuries, it might have developed its own way of understanding volcanic activity. These symbols could be warnings." Marcus pulled out the drone and sent it up for an aerial survey. As it rose, the camera revealed something chilling. A perfect line of similar clearings, all running parallel to the fault line Elena had been studying. "This isn't random," Marcus said, staring at the screen. "The creature knows about the fault line. It's marking it." The trio worked quickly, documenting the site and collecting as much data as possible. But as the sun began to dip lower in the sky, they agreed it was time to head back. As they retraced their steps, the forest seemed to close in around them. The growl Sarah had heard before came again, louder this time, and closer. "It knows we've been here," Sarah whispered, gripping her thermal camera. Elena's heart raced, but she kept her voice steady. "Stay calm. If it wanted to hurt us, it would have already." The growl faded into the distance, and they reached their truck just as night fell. Once safely back at the cabin, they reviewed their findings. The footage from the drone, the thermal images, the tracks, it all painted a picture of a creature deeply connected to the mountain, its behavior seemingly tied to the geological shifts. "This isn't just an animal," Elena said. "It's something more, something ancient, and it knows this mountain better than we ever could." Sarah nodded. "Maybe it's trying to protect the land, or warn us. Either way, we need to take this seriously." Marcus sighed. "The question is, will anyone believe us?" Elena glanced at the pile of evidence they had gathered. "They might not, but we'll keep looking for the truth and for a way to understand what's really happening here." As the cabin grew quiet, the trio knew their journey was far from over. The mountain had revealed its secrets, piece by piece, but the biggest questions still loomed. What was the creature's role in the unfolding events? And how much time did they have before the mountain's fury was unleashed? The mountain's sudden calm. At the USGS base camp near Mount St Helens, Dr. Anders reviewed the latest seismic and gas monitoring data with a growing sense of confusion. "Look at this," he said, gesturing to the laptop screen where a series of graphs displayed recent readings. CO2 emissions are dropping, SO2 levels are stabilizing, and those low-frequency tremors have almost completely subsided. One of his colleagues, a geophysicist named Dr. Layla Hammond, leaned over his shoulder. "That's a sharp reversal. Just a day ago, the data pointed to increasing instability. It doesn't make sense for everything to calm down this quickly without some kind of release. Anders nodded. Exactly. If the system was pressurizing, we should have seen a minor eruption or at least more signs of activity. This sudden lull is unusual. Hammond glanced at the team's drone footage, still displayed on another screen. The fissures, gas vents, and other signs of geological stress remained visible, but nothing seemed to have progressed. Do you think the system has temporarily stabilized? Maybe, Anders said, though his tone lacked certainty. Or there's another factor at play that we don't understand yet. Later that afternoon, as the team continued to monitor the site, one of the field technicians returned from an inspection near the fumaroles. He seemed rattled. "Dr. Anders, you need to see this," he said, holding up a camera. The technician showed a series of photographs taken near the fissures. They revealed deep, jagged scratches along the rock surfaces, like the markings the team had noticed earlier, but more pronounced. "These weren't here yesterday," the technician explained, "and they're not natural. Something or someone made them." Anders frowned. Could they be the result of rockfall or ground movement? The technician shook his head. No way. The patterns are too deliberate. It's like something was clawing at the rock. Hammond raised an eyebrow. "Are we dealing with vandals?" "Unlikely," Anders replied. "This area is remote, and we haven't seen any signs of unauthorized people out here. Let's document this and add it to the report." Despite his calm demeanor, Anders couldn't shake the unease growing in his gut. As the sun began to set, the base camp grew quiet. The team continued to analyze the data, but the once urgent atmosphere had shifted into uncertainty. Anders stared at a map of the region, his thoughts drifting back to Sarah's account of the creature. He dismissed it as folklore, an anecdote not worth pursuing. But now, with the strange scratches, the stabilizing activity, and the creature's reported presence aligning with the fault line, he wasn't so sure. "Layla," Anders said, breaking the silence, "do we have any historical records of unusual phenomena around Mount St Helens before the 1980 eruption?" Hammond tilted her head, considering. "You mean geological phenomena?" "No, I mean accounts of strange animal behavior, unexplained sightings, anything that seemed out of the ordinary." Hammond looked skeptical but nodded. "I'll check the archives. It's a long shot, though." Anders leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the mountain's silhouette against the darkening sky. "Long shots are all we have right now." That night, the team continued their monitoring, but the readings remained stable. The mountain seemed to be in a strange state of equilibrium, as though the pressure beneath its surface had mysteriously dissipated. "This doesn't feel right," Hammond said, staring at the data. "Volcanoes don't just calm down without a reason." Anders nodded, his expression grim. "I agree. Either the system is repressurizing and we're in a temporary lull, or something else is influencing it." The next morning, Hammond returned with historical records. "You're not going to believe this," she said, placing a thick binder on the table. "What did you find?" Anders asked, leaning forward. Before the 1980 eruption, there were multiple accounts of unusual activity in the surrounding forests. Park rangers reported strange noises, massive footprints, and sightings of an unknown creature. Locals claimed the forest felt different, like it was alive. Anders's brow furrowed. "And these reports stopped after the eruption?" Hammond nodded. "Completely. It's like whatever was happening disappeared after the mountain blew." The room fell silent as the weight of her words settled over the team. "You don't think?" Hammond trailed off, glancing at Anders. He shook his head, unwilling to voice the thought, but in his mind the pieces were starting to align. The creature Sarah described, the strange markings near the fissures, the sudden stabilization of the mountain. It was as though something or someone had intervened. Anders stood, his resolve firming. We keep monitoring the mountain, but we also start looking into these historical accounts. If there's even a chance that this creature is tied to geological activity, we need to understand it. The stability we're seeing now could be temporary, or it could be the calm before something much worse. As the team prepared to dive deeper into their investigation, the mountain loomed over them, silent but ever watchful. Whatever secrets it held, they knew time was running out to uncover them. The forest comes alive. The trio had ventured back into the forest to check the trail cameras and revisit the stone circle they had discovered. The air was damp, and the thick canopy muted the sounds of the world around them, leaving only the rustle of leaves and the occasional call of a bird. Sarah led the way, her thermal camera in hand, while Marcus and Elena trailed behind with their packs loaded with tools and supplies. "Trail cam should be just ahead," Marcus said, checking the GPS. As they approached the location, Sarah paused abruptly, raising a hand to signal silence. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. The others stopped, straining their ears. At first, there was nothing, just a faint rustle of wind through the trees. Then it came, a series of sharp, rhythmic knocks echoing through the forest. "Wood knocking," Elena murmured, her voice barely audible. "It's been reported in Bigfoot encounters before, supposedly a form of communication." Marcus frowned, scanning the area. Could be just falling branches or an animal messing with something. Before anyone could respond, another sound joined the knocks, a low guttural murmur that sent chills down their spines. It wasn't human, yet it sounded almost like speech. "Is that chatter?" Sarah whispered, her heart pounding. The strange vocalizations continued, fluctuating in pitch and tone. It was as if multiple entities were speaking in a language they couldn't comprehend. Elena grabbed the audio recorder from her pack and pressed record. "This is incredible. If we can document this, it might be the breakthrough we need." The knocks and chatter seemed to grow louder, as though whatever was making the sounds was moving closer. Sarah raised her thermal camera, scanning the dense foliage. "There's movement," she whispered, pointing to the screen. "About 50 yards out, multiple heat signatures." "How many?" Marcus asked, his voice tight. 3, no 4, Sarah replied. "They're staying just out of sight." Marcus tightened his grip on the bear spray. "I don't like this. It's one thing to track a creature, it's another to have it track us." "We're not running," Sarah said firmly. "This is our chance to observe. Just stay calm." Elena nodded, though her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the audio recorder's settings. The sounds continued, a mix of knocks, chatter, and occasional low growls. Suddenly, one of the heat signatures moved closer, stopping just beyond the edge of visibility. Sarah froze, her eyes glued to the thermal camera. "It's watching us again." Then, as quickly as the sounds had started, they stopped. The forest fell into an eerie silence. "Why did it stop?" Elena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Before anyone could answer, a loud crack echoed through the trees, followed by a thud. They turned to see a large branch lying on the ground, freshly snapped and still quivering. "Okay, that felt intentional," Marcus said, his voice tense. Elena glanced at the branch, then back into the forest. "We might be too close to something they don't want us to find." Sarah frowned, her mind racing. "Or it's a test. We don't know enough about how they communicate to say for sure." The trio decided to retrieve the trail cam footage and retreat to a safer location. As they made their way back to the cabin, they couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Once inside, they reviewed the footage from the trail cam. To their astonishment, it had captured several blurry but distinct figures moving through the trees. "They're massive," Marcus said, pausing the video on a frame showing a shadowy figure nearly twice the height of a human. "And look at the way they move," Elena added. "Not like a bear or any other known animal. This is something entirely different." Sarah leaned back, her mind racing. Between this footage, the audio, and the thermal readings, We're building a case. But we need to figure out why they're so active now. Is it because of the geological shifts or something else? Elena nodded. We also need to decide how far we're willing to push this. If they're intelligent and see us as a threat, we could be in real danger. The trio sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their discoveries pressing down on them. The creatures were real. Of that they were certain. But their motives in connection to the mountain remained a mystery. And as the night deepened, the distant sound of wood knocks echoed faintly through the forest, a reminder that they were far from alone. The next morning, the forest seemed almost unnaturally serene. The trio awoke to the soft chirping of birds and the gentle rustle of the wind through the trees. Gone were the strange knocks, guttural chatter, and ominous growls. The forest felt normal. Elena stood on the cabin's porch, sipping her coffee as she stared out at the dense greenery. The tension that had gripped her for days was slowly easing. "It's quiet," Marcus said, joining her with his own mug. "Too quiet, maybe. Or maybe things are just returning to how they were," Elena replied. "No signs of seismic activity, no strange sounds. It's like the mountain and whatever was out there have decided to rest." Sarah emerged from the cabin, her thermal camera hanging from her shoulder. "I scanned the area this morning. Nothing, not even the faintest heat signature. Whatever we encountered, it's gone." Marcus sighed. "Do you think it's because the mountain stabilized? Like the creature knew its job was done?" Elena shrugged. "If it's connected to the mountain, and I think it is, that's a possibility. Maybe it only appears during times of geological upheaval, to warn, to guard, who knows?" Back inside the cabin, the trio gathered their collected evidence: the trail cam footage, the audio recordings, and Sarah's thermal images. "It's compelling," Elena said, reviewing the footage again. "But without more encounters or physical evidence, it's still not definitive. And the fact that it's gone now makes it even harder to prove," Marcus added. Sarah frowned, flipping through her notebook. "We might not be able to prove anything conclusively, but we've documented enough to make people ask questions. Maybe that's enough to keep the conversation alive." They agreed to compile their findings into a report, one they could share discreetly with trusted scientists and researchers. They knew their evidence would be met with skepticism, but it was too significant to keep to themselves. Over the next few days, life around Mount St. Helens seemed to return to normal. Hikers and tourists returned to the trails, oblivious to the events that had unfolded in the forest. The USGS team reported that the volcanic activity had subsided, labeling it as a minor episode of unrest. The trio, however, couldn't shake the feeling that they had witnessed something extraordinary and deeply tied to the mountain's very essence. "I guess this is it," Sarah said, as they packed up the cabin on their final day. "Back to our regular lives." Marcus grinned. "Regular lives that now include the knowledge that Bigfoot, or something like it, is real." Elena smiled faintly. "And that it might be more than just a creature. It's part of this place, part of its rhythm. And when the mountain stirs again, maybe it will too." As they drove away from the cabin, the trio took one last look at the towering peak of Mount St. Helens, its snow-capped summit gleaming in the sunlight. The forest and the mountain were quiet now, their secrets tucked away once more. But as the wind swept through the trees, Sarah couldn't help but wonder, was it really gone, or was it simply watching, waiting for the day the mountain would stir again? For now, the mystery of the creature and its connection to the mountain remained unresolved, a quiet reminder of the unknown forces that still lingered in the wild corners of the world. Thanks so much from Cryptid Monologues for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit that like button and share your thoughts in the comments below. Make sure to subscribe and click the notification bell so you never miss an update. And hey, while you're here, Check out these videos, you'll definitely love them. See you in the next one.